if you're in handball in the US, you're passionate about the sport because it is by no means the easiest.
You have to be, right?
You have to be. So those are some of the major challenges when we talk about handball.
USA Team Handball has announced, and that is one of the big announcements, I would say.
Sophie here as well. Handball, USA against Greenland. Sophie, fast hold, baseline, straight to the other end for a goal.
Welcome to Red, White, and Blue, the US Team Handball podcast. Today's guest is USA Team Handball Chief Executive Officer Martin Branick. Martin first joined USA Team Handball in 2021 and was named CEO in July of 2023. Martin was born and raised in Denmark, where he developed a passion for handball at an early age. Prior to joining USA Team Handball, his experiences include starting a collegiate club at Kennesaw State University and competing at the senior level with Georgia Handball Club. He received a Bachelor of Business Administration from Kennesaw State and a Master of Sport Administration from Georgia State University.
So he's our CEO of USA Team Handball. Really looking forward to this conversation with him. I started working with USA Team Handball as a national coach in 2022. So it's almost 2 years. I've met Martin when he was still the events and membership manager, right? And then he became this interim CEO, and then now he's the CEO. So responsible for everything in sports development, in basically organizing handball in the US, from club competition to national teams.
And I know that a lot of listeners have sent in questions for him, and I think it'll be a great way for them to kind of, get the facts about USA Team Handball from the person that knows them, right? We can talk all we want and others can talk all they want, but he's the head, he's the boss. And so to get the answers that we're seeking from him is going to be really insightful.
I'm working almost every week with him in a Zoom meeting. I meet him almost every week. I know it's not so much for you, Viva. So I have a really good and close working relationship, especially since he took over as the interim and then CEO of USA Team Handball. How about you, Viva?
Yeah, I've been at several camps and competitions where he's been there, and it's always great to see him just kind of, being in the thick of it with us and interacting and things like that. And so I've always had great conversations with him, and I think he's really passionate about growing the sport for the future, and I think he'll talk a lot about that today. Well, without further ado, let's get into our episode with USA Team Handball CEO Martin Branick. Today we are joined by Martin Branick, the CEO of USA Team Handball. We are so happy to have you as our first guest, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Always excited to talk handball. So can't wait to get started. Excited about this podcast overall, but also excited to talk about both what we're doing now and then all the things we're going to be doing over the next couple of years.
And where are you joining us from today? I know you're in Colorado, but are you still there? I know it's Easter weekend, so...
Yeah, no, I'm in Denver, Colorado. So not a lot of snow as I look out the window, but we have had quite a bit here in the last couple of weeks. So you never really know with Colorado, which I guess is exciting.
Yeah, right. It's always the variety. And so I guess we'll start with our first question. We all love hearing how people find the sport of handball. And so growing up in Denmark is a little bit different than growing up in the US. So we'd like to hear how you found the sport.
Yeah, I think, with handball being Denmark's second biggest sport, right, it was pretty natural. So similar to how a lot of Americans come across football or basketball, hockey, baseball, soccer, whatever it is, right, it kind of comes in as you're growing up. And that's the same for me. I played a lot of different sports as a kid, including handball. I loved it, but I think I was just one of those that played a lot of different sports rather than just focusing on one. So I played handball growing up. I will be the first to admit that I wasn't a great athlete or a great handball player, but I loved it, and I loved the teamwork and the camaraderie that comes with it. So that was kind of how I got exposed to it at an early age. And then I actually ended up in high school playing American football or football. And then when I moved to the US, I quickly realized I was nowhere good enough to play football in college. And I had to find a sport, and I was like, how about this handball, right? So I ended up playing handball in college in the US, starting a handball club, going to college nationals, going to open nationals, and that was kind of my way in initially, also to the American handball community. So definitely different, exposed to it at a young age compared to some of the Americans, but quickly found a passion for it, and a passion that's only grown since then.
And I really like how it would kind of was in your life at the beginning, and then it kind of faded, and then when you came to the United States, it kind of came back into your life. I think that's really interesting and something that a lot of our club members kind of find, that they've moved to the United States and they haven't been able to play the sport that they played in their childhood, and that's why we have a lot of the club membership that we do. And so CEO is a general term. Could you tell our listeners exactly what your job description includes? What are your many responsibilities as head of our national governing body?
Yeah, I don't know if I could list off all the responsibilities here
You're
in this
busy.
podcast. Yeah, that's all we'd be talking about, and I don't think that would be very interesting. But I think overall, it's of course managing and operating the national governing body on a daily basis, right? Taking directions from the board of directors based on the strategy and the path that they envision for the organization, and then executing that. So, in broad terms, that kind of gets into a couple different buckets. The first one, which is probably the least exciting one when you talk about handball, is the administrative side and the compliance side, which ensures that we continue to stay a national governing body, that we're living up to all the requirements that are in our space, of which there are many, and many that I think most people that play the sport don't see, and that's probably a good thing, because if they did, I'm not sure they would play handball, right? And that's part of the national governing body, is for us to do that so that everybody else can focus on handball. Outside of that, domestic competitions, domestic events, national championships, national teams, grassroots and outreach. That's kind of the four overall buckets. Of course, where time is spent varies from week to week and month to month, and ultimately also depends on the overall strategy of the organization. But there's kind of four major buckets: administrative, national teams, domestic events and competitions, and then grassroots. And then one bucket we haven't that kind of covers all of it, which is revenue generation or acquisition, right? Which is a major part of it. But that one kind of extends all over it, because it kind of touches every one of those buckets in some way or fashion.
Yeah, well, you use your bucket analogy, and I think all of us are really thankful for helping us to keep afloat. You know, you talked about the things that the players may not be seeing, and I think that's really the important part, is everybody can be critical when they don't know what's really going on. So we really appreciate your work behind the scenes sometimes. And so I understand that before coming to USA Team Handball, you worked with a Danish professional soccer club. And so that's soccer to us Americans, and that you specialized in corporate sponsorships. What from that experience are you bringing to USA Team Handball?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest difference between that, and I think the biggest difference overall coming into USA Team Handball is going from pro sports into a nonprofit in the Olympic movement, right? Which is very, very different for a number of reasons. I think the biggest thing I took away from my time in soccer was, it's really down to the personal connections you make with your partners in a lot of ways, right? And how important it is to manage those relations, how important it is to make sure that partners feel heard. And in a lot of ways, those key points is also what I try to take with me when we talk about stakeholders within USA Team Handball, right? So not just the partner side, but all the stakeholders, making sure that that we communicate and that we're transparent and that people understand why we're making decisions. And honestly, something that we can continue to do better and better. I think communication continues to be a challenge for us as an organization. There's a number of kind of underlying reasons why that may be, but that doesn't change the fact that it's an area that we have to continue to improve, both towards our internal but also external stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that we can all work on is communication, both within our teams, our networks, and the bigger handball community. So I think just playing that into the bigger scale is really important to talk about. And your journey with USA Team Handball actually started as event and membership development coordinator. How did your experiences from this perspective of USA Team Handball in the nonprofit space help shape your role as CEO today?
Yeah, I think it's, when I started in May of 2021, I think it was a different organization for a lot of reasons, right? I think structurally we were set up differently, but it definitely it played into a lot of my background, which is in events and operations, and I think it allowed me to interact with a lot of our clubs in a different way than if I'd started somewhere else, right? Because I was supposed to be the kind of connection between the federation and the clubs and the members. So I think it gave me a unique perspective on the challenges we face as a sport. Challenges I remember seeing, 12 years ago when I started playing handball in the U.S. Challenges that are still there. But I think it gave me that perspective, which has been really great now, and I think is incredibly beneficial. And then there's the relationships with the clubs, which I think are crucial. And one thing we didn't touch on before, but I think one thing to recognize if you're in handball in the U.S., you're passionate about the sport, because it is by no means the easiest.
You have to be, right?
You have to be. So. Which is also why I love engaging with our members and our clubs, is because they're incredibly passionate. And I think when I moved over here and started playing handball here, that's what I saw as well. And actually quite a few of those connections and friendships I made as a player, I still get to kind of nurse and be in today. And that's incredibly I think personally that's very rewarding when you can kind of see 12 years of friendship still being there and people still being involved. So yeah, our community is our strongest asset by far, and I think we every day look at how can we better support our community, and there's a lot of things we can do better. But yeah, I think coming in through that avenue gave me a good perspective, both on what it means to be an NGB, but also what it means to be a club.
Yeah, and you have really developed handball at all aspects. First at a collegiate club, and then you played with a regular club, and then coming in USA Team Handball in a different position, and then now growing all the way to be CEO. I think you've really been in touch with every level of USA Team Handball. And one thing that we don't really think about sometimes from an outsider's perspective is that USA Team Handball is as much about the clubs that we have as it is about the national teams. So what is your vision for USA Team Handball looking forward at LA28?
That's a very, very loaded question. And I think probably something that in itself could be a series of podcasts talking about the direction. I think what's always important is when we go back and look at the strategic plan that was created in 2018. I think that was a foundation for where we want to be. I think it's also clear that having gone, 6 years down the road through a global pandemic, through now 3 CEOs, it's a plan that also needs to be looked at again, right? And I think ultimately that should be our guiding principle for how we want to develop the sport across all of our avenues, whether it's national teams, grassroots, clubs, domestic competitions. And I think one thing that's important as we look at that is saying it's important to have a plan. Doesn't mean that the plan is that USA Team Handball needs to dedicate all their time in one bucket or two buckets or three buckets. It's about having a plan for each bucket to say, this is how we're going to manage it. These are the people that are going to manage it. This is how we're going to allocate our resources. I've always said that, LA28 presents a unique opportunity. 32 years since we last had Olympic Games on home soil. And there's a lot of things to take away from that. And I think everyone, when they look at 2028, they have a different perspective on what is success and what they want to achieve from that. And I think that's also part of why the strategy is so important, because we need a guiding document and a uniform approach to it. I'll say what my personal takeaway from LA 2028, and that will be very different than a lot of people. And I think that's being in the wheelhouse or being in the engine room. My number one thing coming to 2028 is to take the momentum and the excitement, the awareness that comes from this, and be able to create a stable national governing body and federation on January 1st, 2029. I think that's so important. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot of other things that are important leading up to it. It just means that for me, the success criteria is that once the circus leaves town, that there is a stable national governing body, because I think that's something we've never really achieved. I think we've always kind of had this ebb and flow in the industry. And I think if we can get to a point where we're stable, I think that sets us up for long-term success. And that stability is coming from all the things we want to do leading up to 2028 and from the excitement that comes from it. So that doesn't mean we're not going to focus on all these other things. I think it's just when I kind of sit back at some point in 2029 and look at it, I think that would be really the thing that depends on, or that determines whether I think the next 4 years are a success. If we are stable, financially sustainable, I think is huge, because as we know, stability and in my world also progress comes from being able to have the resources to do what we want to do. And that is by far our biggest constraint right now, is that there's a million things we want to do and a million things we can do to grow the sport. And we're just limited by the resources we have.
I really like that perspective. It's not something that I've thought about before. It's leaving the game better than you found it. Maybe we didn't have the platform after the 96 Olympics in Atlanta. And so having this ability to harness the popularity of the games, but also use it to create more stability within our national governing body, I think that's really important. And it goes beyond just our performance and the performance of our national teams. It's helping our entire country grow the sport. And so now if we can move on to some questions that some listeners sent in that they're interested in. And so can you explain what the role of USA Team Handball is and how handball is organized and facilitated in the United States?
Yeah, so I think, as the national governing body, we're empowered by the International Handball Federation, our Continental Federation, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, to manage the sport of handball in the U.S. Now, if you look at our mission statement, that means to grow the sport and be competitive internationally. Now, of course, there's a lot more components to that than just that one statement. But I think it kind of outlines what's USA Team Handball's purpose. And that is to facilitate growth, field national teams, but overall be a unifying point for handball in the U.S. Now, are there things that we could look at doing better in all those regards? For sure. But I think if you ask what we're here to do is to grow the sport and to be an entity that looks after it, tries to promote it, both at the local, the rec, the regional, the national, and the international level.
Yeah, and another question that they have, it's people living not in the United States. They're looking at the United States and saying, Well, the U.S. and our sports programs seem to have so much money. So why does USA Team Handball seem to suffer from a lack of funds?
Yeah, no, great question. And actually, I am excited to get to answer that a little bit. I think the number one thing that we always have to remember that's different in the US compared to, well, every other country except three others is that Olympic sports in the US are not government funded, right? So there's no government entity. There's not a Department of Sports or a Ministry of Sports um, that supports all of these Olympic disciplines or non-Olympic disciplines. So we rely. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee is a private entity, private nonprofit entity, but we rely on private contributions and partnerships to fund our entire kind of Olympic movement in the U.S. And I think that's one of the biggest differences is when you don't have government funding, you you're just subject to a different set of parameters in terms of getting resources. And then I think it's also important to recognize that there are so many sports, right? There's so many different national governing bodies. And the biggest sports in the US are not within the national governing bodies, right? NBA, NHL, MLB, NFL, MLS, like that's all private entities outside of it. And I think some of those entities have a big focus on grassroots, but I think it's important sometimes that just because we have a huge sports market, it doesn't always trickle down into kind of grassroots. And one good example is from Denmark that I like to use is if you look at the Danish Olympic Committee, a big part of them is kind of the recreational sport, like getting people to be active.
Yes.
And, play sports, meet other people, all this. That's a big part of their purpose. If you look at our Olympic Committee, their purpose is to win medals. Which
very different.
Yeah, and very American. Like that is very staying true to who they are. But I think that's one of the biggest differences. So there's not essentially a foundation of support similar to what you would see in other countries, and then recognizing that because the market is so big, there are a lot of big players, also means that there's a lot of noise to cut through when you're trying to bring awareness to a niche sport like handball. So I think that those are some of the major challenges when we talk about handball versus part of the rest of the world, and especially Western Europe, is that there's not a government funded program. So there's no baseline of support. And then handball is maybe the, and I'll probably say, but 15th, 20th, 25th sport in the US, right? So there's all this noise to cut through as we talk about awareness, both for athletes, but also for partners, which is what we rely on without the government funding.
On that note, you mentioned that the brand USA overshadows so much, so people think that we have so much money, right, which we don't have. Maybe what is one other misconception that talking to Europeans you encountered? Like, for example, for me as a coach, it's always like, oh wait, the players and the coaches they pay for everything, which it kind of is the money thing, but there are so many other things like how many clubs we have, how many courts, how the league system is. Do you have like a personal story where you were like, yeah, no, handball in the US is not like you think it is?
Yeah, I think there's a couple stories that come to mind, but I think when we talk about one of the core fundamentals of playing handball, which is facilities, I think, looking back at the city of 50,000 people that I grew up in Denmark, we had probably 4 or 5 times the number of courts that we do here in the US for a country of 320 million, right? 320 million plus. So I think the number of handball courts we have always kind of sets people back because there's not many. And Hendrik, I know you ran a question on LinkedIn as well on how many do we have. And there's almost no permanently lined handball courts in the US, right? And I think what our clubs also struggle with is access to facilities and the costs of getting access to those facilities. The fact that most gyms in the U.S. are set up to include basketball, which is not big enough to accommodate a handball court. So I think facilities is kind of the one thing that sets people back. It's like as a limiting factor that people don't realize, because they look at the U.S. and says, oh, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of great facilities. And if you look at other sports and see the resources poured into facilities in the U.S., then I think that takes people back when you're talking handball.
I mean, absolutely. I think it's a struggle not only for us to have camps in the United States, but when we do have these camps, sometimes we can't use glue, which a lot of people know is a fundamental aspect of playing handball. And it makes a difference if we're having a pre-tournament camp in the United States and we're not playing with glue, and then we go to this tournament and we play with glue, there's an adjustment period. So not only do we not have courts to play on, but maybe the courts can't accommodate all of our sports you talked about. They might not be big enough, and so we're practicing on a smaller court. And so all of these, seemingly small, we don't have the courts, well, why can't you play on another court? And so they all lead up into bigger things. And another question we had from listeners is that, so what can be done to become more financially stable in the future to avoid a lack of funding going into these competitions and training camps and other events?
Yeah, great question. I think a question that handball in the U.S. has tried to answer over the last 40 years with varying levels of success. I think it's the critical part, kind of going back to the strategy of it. Of course, resource is a big part of the strategy and the path that's laid down. We've kind of tried, different things over the years. Some been more successful than others. I come back to the fact that, if you're able to diversify your revenue generation, so you're not dependent on one or two people or entities, then you're in a lot less of a vital or at least disruptive situation if something happens, right? And I think that's a big part of it. One is, how do you get it? And if someone walked in with a check for $500,000 right now, I think we would all be super excited. But I think similarly, then you're also only dependent on one person, one entity for that. So I think making sure you have a diversified stream of revenue, so you're not dependent on one person or one entity making a decision to support or not support, I think is a big part of being sustainable year over year. There's no doubt that from our side, it's also looking at how do we do more long-term partnerships, both with our corporate partners, but also with our institutional partners like the U.S. Olympic Committee and the IHF, because these one-year partnership deals, they cause at least uncertainty about next year, because you never really know if the funding is there next year until you get to it and they renew, right? So I know it's something that the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee are looking at as well, to say, okay, can we extend this? I will say, and I anticipate this also changing leading up to 2028, is that we'll see an increased interest in partnering with the national governing body and with the sport of handball. And hopefully that will also lead into us being able to better accurately project and plan into the future. So we could actually start doing multi-year projects over just doing 1 year at a time.
Yeah, and that's something that I think before going into all of our competitions, we kind of scramble to find these one-time opportunities to find funds. And so if we could start this process, sooner and find multi-year deals and things like that is, what we're all aiming for. And so a lot of people have been watching the podcast and following us on social media, but they want to know how they can become involved in USA Team Handball.
Yeah. So I think there's so many ways to get involved. One of my best suggestions every time we have people reach out, how do I get involved? One is, of course, understanding how they want to be involved, but then it's really connecting with your local club. Because I think we, as the national governing body, we can play a role in in handball every day, and we do. But I think ultimately the growth and development of handball happens at the local clubs. So I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved with your local club. They can always use passionate volunteers and individuals who want to play or coach or ref or record or whatever it is. And then there are of course also opportunities to get involved with USA Team Handball. And if people are interested, feel free to reach out. We rely heavily, as you guys know, on volunteers who go above and beyond, and I think we end up asking much more than we should, and that's just the nature of where we are. But I think ultimately there's plenty of opportunities to get involved in handball, both at the local, the regional, the national level, and then also at the international level, right? Which is an area where we've seen where our community has gotten more and more involved. We've seen more and more teams go internationally, whether it's at the youth level. Patilia Cup is a good example. At the national team level, right? We're seeing more and more national teams travel, and all of that is thanks to passionate volunteers, right? So if you think about, can I make a difference in handball? Absolutely, you can, and you can do it at every level, and that's maybe something that's a little unique for handball versus some of the other sports in the U.S., right? Is that if you're interested, there is really kind of a wide range of opportunities to get involved.
You mentioned, or USA Team Handball has announced, and that is one of the big announcements, I would say, since you took over as a CEO, that 3 working groups are formed and are starting to work. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the LA28. I know there's the Paris 2024 and the coaching education working group. I think that is an interesting topic.
Yeah, so I think it's all the 3 working groups was really a way to try to engage our community in a different way, right? Different ways, and I think they all kind of fit within a certain area. And we launched a second phase of working groups as well to support that. And I think it's the next step for us to try to engage with the community, but also leverage all of the passionate, intelligent, and handball savvy people who are in our community, right? When we are a smaller organization, I think it's important that we rely on the community as well to grow. So they each kind of have their own thing, or their own kind of parameters to look at. Of course, the LA one is a little more long term in terms of looking at how do we utilize the 2028 games to grow the sport and to leave a legacy. I think that's always a challenge, and people have tried, after every home game, to say how do we best leave a legacy, and how do we leave that, to your point, how do we leave the sport better than we found it? And I think that's a huge part of it, really engaging with that. The Paris one is very focused on the summer, obviously. The coaching, education, and licensing to me is a critical group to start being able to provide the content, the education needed to develop coaches in the U.S. In the U.S., we have a shortage of pretty much everything. Like, we could use more players, we could use more coaches, we could use more referees.
Yep.
But there's no doubt that the latter two, the coaches and the referees, also provide a constraint to handball. Because when we talk about developing athletes, that comes from especially the coaches, right? So we, in turn, to develop better and better athletes, we need to develop better and better coaches. And similarly, we need to recruit and develop better and better referees, because better athletes need better referees to properly play the game, right? Both from an athlete safety perspective, but also from an understanding of letting the players play, and making sure that your calls as a referee kind of match up with the level of the players. And now I'm talking as a referee, right? So
Your
it's
experience.
dear to my heart to talk about the different things. And like, I'll admit that when I watch a handball game, I can just sit there and just look at the referees, especially when you look at the professional, the Champions League, the World Championships, etc. Like, they're such a crucial part of it. And we talk a lot at the international level about referees, right? Because they play such a crucial role. So I think the coaching working group is so important in that regard for the coaches. The board of directors just approved a new guiding document for our referee committee. So I think we're starting to see some changes there, and how do we approach it, and how do we grow the sport. And in both areas, there are very passionate people who dedicate their time that we're greatly dependent on to grow each area, which is crucial, going back to our members, because if I go to a handball event, I often get to talk about the referees and the coaches. So making sure that we grow that with everything else is critical.
Let the players play is a good statement. And I know, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked off air about a project that you want to launch with the Summer Olympics, right, in Paris. Is that a project you can already, I know the name, is that already something you can give us a little bit more details about?
Yeah. So Try Handball is really the name of the project and the initiative, and it's the goal of the project is really to help funnel interest into the right. Talking about buckets, right bucket. You would think we're a basketball podcast about buckets so much, but no, but right into the right bucket and right area, right? So if someone finds the sport this summer, looking at Paris or around the games, how do we direct them into the right area? Whether it's coaches, referees, I want to play, I want to watch, I want to grab a T-shirt. All of these things should be readily available, and that's really what Try Handball is. There's a lot of different components to it, and things that we're still building out on our end. But the goal kind of is to capture the interest that comes in, and then direct it into the right area. And if you look at our interest curve over a 4-year period, you'll see a huge peak at the Olympic Games, right? So it's really a way to try to capture that and funnel it the right way, especially to our local clubs in their area, because that's always, again, going back to ways to get involved. That's a great way to start to get involved and learn the sport if you're new to it. And I promise you'll be met with people who are very happy to see you. And who are happy to share on their love for the sport.
And I think Try Handball is such a good name because I think everybody who tries handball, the majority of them stick with playing handball. It's just about getting them to try and getting them to take the first step. And so if we can harness the popularity that comes with the Olympics, whether, that's watching or seeing maybe a highlight on your Instagram feed. And so if we can harness that into getting them to play or just to watch or just to invest in USA Team Handball. And so when we close each podcast with a guest, we end with a positive 2-minute. 2 quick questions just to leave for the audience. So the first one is, what's the glue that has made handball stick, and what's going to make it stick in the United States?
The people, undoubtedly the people. It is like an extended family when you go to a handball event. I think it's, and that's not just in the U.S., but also internationally, right? If you go to Patilya Cup, which I've been a couple of times, I've refereed at one, you really see what handball is all about. And it is about the community and the people. And the same thing in the U.S. When you go to an event, you see people that, well, in my case, I've played against in college or that I've refed. They're probably less happy with me. But it's really what it comes down to is the people. And the people are critical to the success of our sport, and they're also the glue that keeps everything together. Without them, we wouldn't be anywhere. So yeah, the people for sure.
The last question is: imagine you're in the huddle with handball players from around the world. What advice from your experiences do you share with them, our listeners?
That's a good question. I think it's don't underestimate the power of the sport, right? Like it's a unifier in so many ways. It opens the door to so many opportunities. I think opportunities that a lot of other sports can't offer. So if I was to give advice to anyone who's playing handball, who's considering playing handball, it is to jump into it, lean into it, because I promise your life will be better off if I haven't been involved in handball. There'll be some grief, I'm sure. There'll be a lot of frustration, and it's not easy by any means. But it is so rewarding and so worth it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us as our first guest, Martin. It's been great to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always happy to talk handball.
So I think that was a great conversation that we just had with Martin. How about you?
I agree. Love talking to him. I think the perfect first guest to have on the episode, on the podcast.
Definitely.
Loved it.
And so now that our listeners have listened to the second episode, we need to tell them where they can follow us. So they can follow us on Instagram at USA Handball WNT and at USA Team Handball. On YouTube is where we're posting the videos of these podcasts. So if you want to see our faces, go to USA Team Handball on YouTube. And then, of course, the USA Team Handball website, which is just usateamhandball.org.
Tell us in the comments what you thought about Martin's answers, about the future of US handball, how he envisions it, and how we can achieve it. And if you want to be part of USA Handball, then let us know. Shoot us a DM or a comment here in the comment section, or reach out directly to USA Team Handball, because as Martin said, the best way to grow the sport is to get involved. And we need a lot of volunteers to really make this America's next great sport.
Absolutely. That's all of our aims. So thank you all for listening to this episode of Red, White, and Blue.